Hello, we are going to hop into our last lecture before we have an exam. This is the lecture on the struggle for equal rights. So we will have our exam will cover everything from this lecture all the way back to the beginning of the semester. In my notes, that's the first 6 chapters, but I think y'all's chapters are maybe not exactly the same. So the struggle for equal rights and backwards, everything that we've had up this entire semester. I'm going to post the exam Monday morning at 9 a.m. and you will have until Thursday at 9 a.m. to finish it. That should give you plenty of time. That should give you plenty of time to study and be prepared, but also it's going to be timed the same way your quiz was. And so once you start, you will have a certain amount of time until it is completed. If you have any questions, let me know, but do make sure that it is completed by 9 a.m. next Thursday. That is 20% of your grade, so make sure you pay attention. It's going to be mostly fill in the blank, or multiple choice, I mean. It may have some fill in the blanks with a word bank. Everything that's been covered so far, take the quizzes that the website in your book directs you to. That helps. And make sure you study your vocabulary words. All right, we're going to dive into the lecture, The Struggle for Equal Rights. So in the 2016 election, it was really a time for coming out of the shadows. Trump really showed that an America First mentality worked electorally. He really opposed immigration and multiculturalism and the classic democratic values that undergird the American political system. He has maybe encouraged bigotry, saying the big problem in this country is being politically correct. We talked a little bit about that last class. A lot of folks really felt liberated by his campaign, and a lot of folks thought that maybe their ideas were being taken out of the darkness. But our mainstream America is really becoming more diverse. There were vocal supporters of Trump, but there were also a lot of Trump supporters that were rural males without college educations who would never think of themselves as racist, but recognize the white privilege that they were born with. Only in its absence can they compete for the dwindling share of the American dream as they were told their birthright and who believe they are, in fact, targets the racist behavior. Trump used language that was key to invoke nostalgia for America long gone, make America great again. He used again. Now he's saying keep America great. And really wants to throw back to folks who thought that America isn't as great as it once was. This is more of a cultural nostalgia, which is great for some, but not for others. Women, African Americans, maybe those groups are not as excited about going back to times past. Racism has really been a permanent thread in American political fabric and may always be, but there are new, undeniable facts. The racial landscape is changing. The whites are a diminishing racial group. People of color are growing in numbers. There are nearly 11 million undocumented workers that live and work in the United States with no way to repatriate them. We had a black man elected to serve 2 terms in the White House, President Obama. And we had a newly elected Republican government that came in promising to dismantle some of the work that he had done. So we're going to examine that just a little bit during this lecture. I know this is a sensitive topic. This is a sensitive chapter to be discussing, especially in the light of the Black Lives Matter and a lot of other things like that are going on right now. So I just want to put the disclaimer that I'm trying to I'd like to be as by the book this chapter as I can be. Sometimes I kind of give some of my own opinions and ideas, but I think this is too sensitive to really do that. So I'm going to really try to stick to the text on this one as much as I can. If I can relay any ideas and clips about what's going on in the current political world, I will, but I don't want to be misstrued or this is really sensitive, I guess is what I'm saying. So I'm going to try to stick straight to the facts as much as I can on this one. Everybody has a lot of different opinions and values, and I don't want to diminish anybody in this lecture. So I hope that disclaimer is okay. I'm trying to be fair and impartial. All right, so where am I? I lost my place in my notes. All right, so civil rights. We talked a little bit last class. So these are citizenship rights guaranteed to the people primarily in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments that are protected by the government. But formally granting somebody a civil right doesn't necessarily bring about a speedy change in social and economic status, right? This can be Native Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, anybody that has faced unequal treatment in the legal system, the job market, and schools. Women, half the population, have long struggled to gain economic parity with men. Sexual orientation, age, physical ability, citizenship status, these are also groups that have been denied rights. Intersectionality, these are the interdependent discrimination and oppression that results when you are a member of more than one oppressed minority group. So for example, you are Black, female, and poor. That is an intersectionality of reasons that you are discriminated against. The United States is haunted by treatments of unequal treatment, by traditions of unequal treatment and intolerance that we can't entirely shake. And this is very obvious in our culture right now. So what is the meaning of political inequality? When is different treatment okay? Americans expect that the law should treat some people equally, but laws by nature must treat some people differently, right? Laws discriminate between those who abide by society's rules and those who don't, but it can also treat criminals differently once they're convicted, right? So in all but 2 states, felons are denied the right to vote for some length of time, and in some states permanently. I clerked for a judge when I graduated from law school, and I will never forget this man had his moment to speak to the judge before he was sentenced, and he said, "Judge, please don't take away my right to vote." And that really stuck with me. I was like, wow, good for you, sir. That's such an important thing. Voting is so important to me. And so it was really interesting to hear him say, you're going to take away my right to vote if you find me guilty in this. So felons really are, once you're convicted, you are treated differently. You're not allowed to vote anymore. But if somebody's denied a right based on a characteristic like race or religion or sexual orientation or age or wealth, we say the law discriminates them and they're denied the equal protections of law. So there are 3 legal classifications here. There are classifications of people that are so rarely Constitution, they're immediately suspect. Suspect classifications require the government to have a compelling state interest for treating people differently. Race is a suspect classification, where a discriminatory law must be justified by a compelling state interest. And courts subject this to a heightened standard of review called strict scrutiny. This is, courts look carefully at the law and government interests involved. The catch is while the laws discriminate against the suspect class are examined carefully, so are laws that discriminate in their favor. In the second, these are called quasi-suspect. So the first was suspect, and the second is quasi-suspect. They may or may not be legitimate grounds for treating people differently. This is subject to an intermediate standard of review. This is a standard of review used by the court to evaluate laws that make a quasi-suspect classification. So the court looks at the law, see if the law requiring different treatment bears a substantial relationship to an important state interest. The important state interest test is not as hard to meet as the compelling state interest test. Maybe a law that treats a woman differently than a man falls into this category. And then the least scrutinized, so the first suspect maybe is racial, the second quasi-suspect maybe like men and women, and then the third is non-suspect. This is subject to the minimum rationality test, which is a standard of review that asks whether the government had a rational basis for making a law that treats a given class of people differently. So law that discriminates based on age, for example, like a curfew for young people, or economic level. So you have a higher tax rate for those who fall into a different income bracket. They don't need to stem from a compelling or an important government interest. They just must have a rational basis for making the law. This is pretty easy for a legislature to show. All 3 of these groups feel that they're discriminated against. They all want the Supreme Court to view them as a suspect class, so they'll be a protected group. The civil rights and the 14th Amendment might protect them anyway, but if they're designated as a suspect class, the Supreme Court is unlikely to permit any laws to treat them differently. So gaining this status is crucial in the struggle for equal rights. I'm sorry, Betsy's been joining me for my lectures lately. I hope she's not bothering you guys, but say hi. She doesn't want to be put down right now. And big brother and big sister are at school, so she's not distracted by anybody and is in my lap. All right, so in the 1950s, race became a suspect class, and they were able to be protected a little bit differently. The LGBT community has really struggled to get the Supreme Court to consider them in the quasi-suspect category. They didn't have a specific standard of review when the Defense of Marriage Act was struck down in 2013, but some states have passed different legislation to prevent discrimination. Why do we usually deny rights? This is usually explained by creating a narrative focused on characteristics of a group. A group maybe is not civilized, doesn't recognize the true God. People are compelled to justify poor treatment by blaming the group that they are treating poorly. People often deny the rights of others because rights are power. Rights are power. To deny a right is to have power over someone, and how they will live their lives is to force them to conform to our will. Slaves are compelled to work for a master's profit. Women were denied the right to divorce their husbands. We think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She really changed the landscape for women and the many different things that women can do now thanks to her. But women previously were denied a lot of rights. Native Americans were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands so that lands could be developed. Denying a right keeps someone submissive and dependent. When somebody finds their voice and can effectively demand rights, laws change, and they can soon leave subservience behind. People also deny rights to isolate categories of people. Recent immigrants who don't speak English, homosexuals who folks believe have lifestyles that are threatening, people who have an unfamiliar religious belief. This helps a group build a narrative that defines who they are and who the relevant community is and who they're not. These communities believe that they, with their cultural values and beliefs, are superior to people who are different. This promotes cohesion and builds loyalty to the people who are like us and intensifies dislike and hostility toward those who are maybe not our kind. This is only a small step away from believing that there are people outside their community who don't deserve the same rights as those superior people. I don't know why I keep doing this within. There are different kinds of equality. There are different disputes that arise because we often think equal must mean identical or the same, thus making equality threatening to the American value system, which prizes freedom to be different and unique. We rely on the government to guarantee fair treatment and equal opportunity, procedural guarantees, rather than to manipulate fair and equal outcomes, the substantive guarantees. We want to treat everyone the same, and we want people to be free to be different, but we don't want to treat people differently in order to make them equal at the end. Think about how procedural guarantees are so important to this country. We want to make sure that the playbook is the same, but we don't want to guarantee all the same outcomes. When the laws are changed, this is a procedural solution, but substantive action sometimes needs to be there to ensure equal treatment in the future, right? All right, so rights that have been denied based on the basis of race. Oh, baby. The narrative of white supremacy and black inferiority were told to numb sensibilities of European Americans. This has almost been as dangerous as slavery itself and has really lived on in the American psyche and in politics much longer than the practice that they justified. Racism is the institutionalized power inequalities in society based on the perception of racial differences. This is not a Southern problem or a black problem. This is an American problem and one that we haven't eradicated from national culture, as we are seeing so prominently in the media today. Do you think it would be a good thing or a bad thing if we treated all people exactly the same? What would that look like? Something to think about. All right, so what about blacks in America before the Civil War? At the time of the Civil War, there were almost 4 million slaves in the South and nearly 500,000 free blacks in the rest of the country. But even if slavery was illegal, blacks didn't enjoy the full rights of citizenship. In the Dred Scott case in 1957, the Supreme Court ruled that blacks can't be citizens because the founders had not considered them citizens when the Constitution was written. Abolitionists were a coalition of free blacks and northern whites that were working to end slavery prior to the Civil War. They tried strategies. They put pressure on the Republican Party to take a stand against political equality, and they persuaded a few different legislatures to hold a statewide vote on black suffrage, but they lost all of them. Even in the North, public opinion didn't favor blacks. So after the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln was not simply taking a moral stand with the Emancipation Proclamation. He was trying to use economic pressure to keep the country intact. This didn't free all slaves, only those in states that rebelled against the Union. There were no real winners in the Civil War. It took a toll on the North and in the South, and neither World War could claim as many casualties as the Civil War did. All right, so the 13th Amendment, it banned slavery. It was passed by Congress in January of 1865. It was a huge blow to Southern white power. The South retaliated to ensure their dominance. They had black codes. These were a series of laws in the post-Civil War South that were designed to restrict the rights of former slaves before the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments. They essentially sought to keep blacks in a subservient economic and political position by legally restricting most of their freedoms, voting, property owning, education, and that they'd gained by becoming a citizen. In Reconstruction, the period following the Civil War, during which the federal government took action to rebuild the South, there was the 14th Amendment passed in order to make the black codes unconstitutional, and the 15th Amendment in 1879 that effectively extended the right to vote to all adult males. Southern life began to change. Blacks voted, some were elected to local office. This cemented the Republican dominance with their support, but Southern whites responded with violence. The KKK terrorized blacks. There was lynching, there was arson, there was beatings, and made it scary to associate with Republicans. Lincoln was a Republican, remember that. And so Southerners set about the business of stripping blacks of their newfound political power. Disenfranchising blacks became an easy thing to accomplish. The 15th Amendment said the right to vote couldn't be denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So the Democrats who controlled the South set out to deny it in other ways. Things like poll taxes that were levied as a qualification for voting. This took away the right to vote from most blacks who were too poor to pay to vote. Literacy tests. These are votes requiring reading or comprehension skills as qualifications for voting. Jim Crow laws. These are laws that the Southerners designed to circumvent the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to deny blacks rights on basis other than race. Segregation, obviously, the practice and policy of separating races. Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case that established the Constitution of the principle of separate but equal. At the time, folks embraced the separate part but forgot the equal part of this ruling, and they thought that the Supreme Court approved segregated facilities. The NAACP was founded in 1910 to promote civil rights for African Americans, and they finally were able to start developing a strategy that was the undoing of these Jim Crow laws. They supported the FDR's New Deal. They wanted to woo black voters from the Republican Party, and Democrats gave as much influence to blacks as they dared without alienating powerful Southern Democratic congressmen. Thurgood Marshall came about, and he decided to launch an attack on education. The poor quality of black education in the South reinforced beliefs about black inferiority. Instead of immediately targeting elementary schools, which would have really terrified whites, they started with law schools, which they knew would fly under the radar of most. There were no black law schools, and the Supreme Court knew this. This was a masterful strategy. The justices had the shared experience of going to law school, so it was impossible for them to refute arguments that a separate education was unequal. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. This was the Supreme Court case that rejected the idea that separate could be equal in education. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled in favor of Linda Brown and the black students. They held that separate by its very definition can never be equal because the separation itself made black children feel unequal. Segregation in education was inherently unconstitutional. This didn't bring about instant relief to the Southern school system, though. There were a lot of blatant attempts to avoid compliance, and it took a long time. And this really proved to be a catalyst for the civil rights movement that would change the whole country. So the civil rights movement, in 1955, Rosa Parks sat on a bus in Alabama and refuses to yield her seat to a white passenger, so she was arrested and sent to jail. So there was a boycott, the refusal to buy certain goods or services as a way to protest policies or force political reform. There were local groups in the black community that boycotted the Montgomery bus system, and they made up for most of the bus riders, but the bus boycott continued before the Supreme Court affirmed a lower court case that was unconstitutional, that separate bus accommodations were not equal. All right, there are two kinds of discrimination: de jure, which is discrimination by the law. De jure discrimination that arises from or is supported by the law. Discrimination by law. This is what most blacks in the South faced, especially in rural areas where blacks and whites worked and lived side by side and had to use separate facilities because the law said so. And then there's de facto discrimination. This is discrimination in fact. De facto discrimination in fact. This is the discrimination that's not a result of law, but rather of tradition and in habit. It's a lot more difficult to eliminate. Segregation in the North was this way because blacks and whites didn't live and work in the same places. It wasn't laws that kept them apart, but past discrimination, tradition, custom, economic status, and residential patterns. It was hard to remedy because there were no laws to change. So changing the rules, fighting de jure discrimination. Martin Luther King Jr. became known for his nonviolent approach to political protest, not just for the practices that it challenged directly, but for the pressure that was brought to bear. JFK didn't want to alienate Southern Democrats, but the political pressure of Black interest groups forced him to take a visible stand. He sent mediators to Birmingham to negotiate an end to segregation, then sent a massive package of civil rights legislation to Congress. He didn't live to see them become law, but LBJ made them his top priority. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 allowed discriminatory tests like literacy tests and provided for federal examiners to register voters throughout much of the South. The Supreme Court backed this up. You guys, this is 1965 that this is happening. That doesn't feel like that long ago, right? Like, this isn't the Civil War time. This is 100 years later. Or 100, anyway. Yeah, so the 24th Amendment outlawed federal poll taxes in federal elections. And then how do we fight de facto discrimination, the more law in fact, or discrimination in fact? Black Muslims, led by Malcolm X, Black Panthers, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they all demanded Black power and radical change. They rejected Martin Luther King's peaceful attempt to bring about gradual change. Busing, they wanted to achieve racial balance by transporting students to schools across neighborhood boundaries. They had Black students bus into white neighborhoods and vice versa. The Supreme Court endorsed busing as a remedy for segregated schools, but ruled 3 years later that the busing plans couldn't merge inner city and suburban kids unless officials could prove that the district lines had been drawn in a racially discriminating manner. Sorry. Get some lipstick on you. Some early efforts at affirmative action. As the North showed, the absence of legal discrimination doesn't mean equality. In 1965, the Johnson executive order prohibited discrimination in firms in doing business with the government and ordered them to take affirmative action to compensate for past discrimination. Affirmative action, as we know, this is a policy of creating opportunities for members of certain groups as a substantive remedy for past discrimination. We were at the beach with my family recently and had a huge debate about affirmative action. Do we think, so the end result of affirmative action seems attractive, but the means to get there, treating people differently, seems inherently unfair in the American value system. Do you agree or disagree with that? So if, for example, if a firm had no Black employees, it wasn't enough to not have a policy against hiring them. They had to actively recruit and hire Blacks. This counted in universities as well. The Supreme Court affirmed this decision, though it took issue occasionally with some specific implementations. This is still an issue the Supreme Court is dealing with now. There's some Ivy League universities that are going through some affirmative action cases right now. Do we think, so I'm going to say that again, the end result of affirmative action seems attractive, right? Having everybody have a fair chance, but the means to get there, treating people differently, that seems inherently unfair in our American value system, right? Should we all go the same way? Do you agree or disagree? My sister texted me yesterday. She had watched Little Fires Everywhere. I don't know if you guys watched it. It was on Hulu. We read the book and watched the series, and we were talking about it, and she said she really enjoyed, there was a line that the Kerry Washington character said to the Reese Witherspoon character. She said, you didn't make good choices. You had good choices to choose from. And I think that is so important when you're thinking about affirmative action. Some people have better choices to choose from than others. And so that's something to really think about. That's just such a powerful line, like that we even were talking about it after watching it. Anyway, political gains and losses. In 2008, Obama was elected. We had an African American who was given the chance and the opportunity to serve 2 terms as the president of the United States. He increased voter turnout with African Americans, and he promised a Russian and more relaxed attitude toward race. But he still faced obstruction from Congress and many Americans who even said he wasn't born in the United States and wasn't ever qualified to be president. Somebody has called Trump's election a white lash to Obama's presidency. You think that's true? Affirmative action today, we can't really be about racism and bigotry, but what images of what America ought to be about. There's one side who has a vision of America whose discriminatory past is the past, and their job is to treat all citizens the same. People providing a lower set of standards is not fair to anybody. People tend to perform at the level of competition. When the bar is raised, we tend to rise to that occasion. And that's, Ward Connolly, an African-American businessman, said that is what Black students will do in a society that has equal standards for all. We all raise the bar, and we all rise to the occasion. Then there's the other side of this, who argue that affirmative action programs have made a difference in equalizing chances in society, and though they're meant to be temporary, their work is not yet done. I don't know. What do we think? Affirmative action is really something to really think about. Rights denied on the basis for race and ethnicity. Native Americans, the relationship between the original inhabitants of this continent and the colonists to give their government has been difficult. There are lingering effects of that still today. The Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, gives Congress the power to regulate trade with foreign nations among the several states and with the Indian tribes. They're perceived as neither foreign countries nor states. In 1831, the Supreme Court said they are domestic dependent nations. They are citizens of tribes as well as citizens of the United States with rights coming from each. And there are reservations are separate but legal entities under the federal government. Since the 1980s, they've parlayed their status as semi-sovereign nations into a foundation for economic prosperity. If a state allows any gambling at all, then an Indian reservation in that state may allow all sorts of gambling. This is subject only to the Bureau of Indian Affairs under the Department of Interior. And a lot of them have giant casinos. Why are you eating the counter? And money pouring into their coffers because of this. Some see Indians as gambling. Some Indians see gambling as their economic salvation, and some of them see it as spiritually ruinous. Hispanic Americans, another group with a diverse group with a history of discrimination, they face a lot of challenges of their own trying to fight discrimination and raise their standing. They have a language barrier sometimes, political reaction to immigration. They're the largest minority group in the United States. There are some English-only movements. Their efforts to make the English the official language of the United States. It's appeared on ballots and official documents. This is clearly about more than language, though. It's about national and cultural identity and a struggle to lay claim to the voice of America. But we have had some political wins. The Hispanic community has had, in 2009, Obama appointed Sonia Sotomayor, to be the first Hispanic justice on the Supreme Court. Oh, goodness. All right. Asian Americans, they also face discrimination. They're identifiable by their appearance, and so it's harder for them to assimilate into a European American population. There are exclusionary laws of 1882 and 1925, but anti-Asian sentiment was at the highest during World War II. Oh, we're having a hard time. Japanese Americans were rounded up and forced to abandon or sell property. They were put in detention camps for national security reasons, though 2/3 of them were American citizens. The unusual features of Asian Americans, one of the unusual features is their overall academic success and economic prosperity. They have a cultural emphasis on hard work and high achievement that lent well to success in American education and a culture of equality and opportunity. Many were highly skilled in their own countries, and they pass along these values. This stands in an odd relationship to affirmative action because often they are admitted at high levels to elite schools. And sometimes the policies harm them because they are so well qualified, they would be admitted even if race were not taken into account. So policies that pit minority groups against each other in this way don't promote solidarity and community among them. An interesting political point about the Asian American community is that the voter turnout should be quite high in this group because voter turnout usually corresponds with education and income. But Asian American turnout is typically the lowest in the nation, which is so interesting. They tend to register as independents, and they simply may not vote because nobody asks them to. So it's really, I thought that was really interesting. Sometimes rights are also denied on the basis of gender. Women's struggle for equal rights has probably been the most peculiar because women were not outside the system in the same way that racial and ethnic groups have been. Women's work was in the home. White women were to be good and pure, and they were too chaste to deal with the sordid world outside. Some still feel this way. The struggle for women's rights hasn't won the support of all women and is actively opposed by some, as well as many men whose power and standing and worldview is threatened. So women weren't exactly slaves, but not much different. When a woman married, she merged her legal identity with her husband. She could no longer be a party to a contract. She could no longer bring a lawsuit or inherit property. She can't earn wages for anything or gain custody of her children in cases of divorce, initiate divorce from an abusive husband. If her husband was not a United States citizen, she lost her citizenship. And then neither married nor unmarried women could vote. Unmarried women didn't have a lot of opportunities. They had to work in domestic service and later in the textile industry. Most married women didn't work outside the home. Women trying to climb up the ranks, they targeted states that were sympathetic towards them. They gradually gained some political clout that their demands were listened to on a national level. In 1919, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment granted women the right to vote. It was introduced by Congress by Woodrow Wilson. It was passed in both houses. In 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify it, and women finally had the right to vote nationwide. I think a lot of people noticed that we celebrated 100 years of women voting just this past August. Isn't that crazy? Women have only been able to vote for 100 years. If women gained equal rights, they thought that an entire way of life would be over. This was probably true. A lot of women lacked the money and political contacts and experience to get involved in politics, and politically active women were ostracized and accused of being unfeminine. This made political involvement too costly to many. So 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, but it didn't ensure constitutional protection against discrimination. The Equal Rights Amendment was a constitutional amendment passed by Congress, but it was never ratified. That would have banned discrimination on the basis of power. The Supreme Court began striking down some laws that treated women differently and using equal protection from the 14th Amendment. They took this as a sign that the Equal Rights Amendment was unnecessary. Do you think it's possible to have too much equality? Something to think about. Some gender discrimination today, there are some laws that do treat men and women differently that have been upheld by the Supreme Court. For example, like a statutory rape laws requiring that only males be drafted. The Paycheck Fairness Act prohibits discrimination and retaliation against workers who bring discrimination claims. This passed the House in 2009, but it stalled in the Senate. We're having a hard time. It's hard. Republicans claim that women make less money for reasons other than discrimination, like they leave the labor market to have children for reasons that I'm dealing with right now. What if I stand up? Will you do better if I stand up? All right. They say that market forces should prevail without any regulation. All right. Sexual harassment. The unwelcome sexual speech or behavior that's created in a hostile work environment. Often workplaces are unpleasant and offensive and unusually stressful. Women face retribution sometimes. And this was the Me Too movement. Okay. The Me Too movement, where this came about fairly recently. We all saw a lot of this. There's a high rise in the number of discrimination cases reported by pregnant women. Roughly half say their bosses reacted negatively to their pregnancies. And I have actually run into that myself. But in 2016, we had the first woman presidential candidate. And, Nancy Pelosi in 2006 became the first female Speaker of the House. She is currently the Speaker of the House again. She's about 150 years old, but she is quite the champion for women. I don't share a lot of opinions with her, but I'm really impressed by the work that she has done, especially for women. Rights denied on other bases. Until 2011, gays couldn't serve in the military. And the Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996 that asserted that states didn't need to recognize gay marriages performed in other states. The Supreme Court struck this down in 2013. Another thing that is discriminated sometimes, age. In 1976, the Supreme Court said that age is not a suspect class, and that they can pass a law that treats younger and older people differently. Younger people can't vote, but older people can defend their interests effectively. Voter participation tends to rise with age, and older Americans are typically more well-organized politically. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act. People with mental and physical disabilities have organized to fight for their rights with civil rights. This group empowered racial and gender groups, protected the rights of the disabled, and guaranteed protection from biased employment. Citizenship. Should non-citizens have same rights as citizens? The Constitution gives most of them the same rights except for the right to vote. Can you think of other groups that face discrimination? The citizens and civil rights. I'm almost done. The pluralist model of democracy really best describes the actions that citizens have taken to gain the government's protection of their civil rights. This emphasizes the way that citizens can increase their individual power by organizing into groups. I've given you some questions to think about throughout this lecture. Do you think it'd be a good thing or a bad thing if we treat all people the same? Do you think affirmative action, the means to getting to affirmative action, seems inherently unfair? Do we agree or disagree? Is it possible to have too much equality? Can you think of other groups that face discrimination? These are just some things I want you to think about. I'm not going to make you email me because we've already done that once this week. And we're probably distracted by a crying baby right now anyway. If you have any questions, please email me. That is it for this lecture. We will not have any lectures next week. All we'll have is our exam. Email me if you have any questions. Your exam will be posted Monday at 9 a.m. You will have, it will be timed once you begin it, but you can start it anytime, and it's due, it has to be completed by Thursday morning at 9 a.m. It will be posted for that long, and then it expires the same way your quiz did. Have any questions, please email me. I'm sorry for the little distraction just now, but please let me know if you have any questions. I will post your exam starting Monday morning at 9 a.m., and we will not have any lectures next week, so I will look forward to speaking to you again in 2 weeks. Have a good one.